So today we are going to hear from Brandon Herman. He's a certified professional planner and a licensed landscape architect with experience on a broad spectrum of projects that required attention to both the complex site-specific design solutions and inclusive long-range visioning. In his current role as Sustainable Infrastructure Planner and Project Manager with the San Antonio River Authority, he aids developers, institutions, and communities in the design, implementation, and long-term success of their low-impact development goals. Over his 10 years of professional experience, Brandon has worked for a traditional landscape architecture firm, developing plan sets and detailed construction drawings, an urban design and planning firm facilitating community-driven design solutions, and drafting planning policy, and most recently, a public agency implementing watershed protection and restoration measures. Brandon received both his MLA and his MS in urban planning from CAPLA here at the U of A. So I'd like to welcome Brandon, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so he can open up his presentation.
Thank you, Gina. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Excellent. It's organized a bit. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for having me. Again, my name is Brandon Herman. I want to give a big thanks to Gina and Laura and Lori and the rest of the staff for organizing this event. I'm happy to be the guinea pig for the first Zoom lecture series event here. I appreciate the invitation to speak. The presentation, Changing Course, Lessons from a Career Rover. I'll get to what I kind of mean by that in a moment. As Gina mentioned, I'm currently a sustainable infrastructure planner for the San Antonio River Authority in San Antonio, Texas. I'm both a planner and a landscape architect, received both of those degrees from CAPLA, proud alum, bear down. So today I'm going to discuss a little bit about my background, my professional roles and associated work. And I want to talk a bit about alternative career paths, maybe some career paths you hadn't thought of yet. And finally, I'll field any questions or we can open up a forum for discussion. And I do want to note that, you know, I can be your insider person. So if you have any difficult questions or anything you feel uncomfortable about, or you think that, you know, it's taboo to ask the question, either ask it or I'll have my email at the end and you can shoot me an email. I'm a pretty candid person. So with that said, career rover. So the definition here, a person who spends their time wandering and or a player not restricted to a particular position on the field. And so I'm a career rover by definition. I would say both of these definitions hold true to my trajectory so far. I've had kind of more design and planning jobs than most people do in their entire careers, which could be viewed as a negative thing. However, this has given me experience and skills in a broad range of specialties, you know, different focus areas, scales, firm organizational structures. So I'm an absolute generalist to the T by definition. I'm a jack of all trade, master of like a couple. I can wear many different hats. I've worked with and managed multidisciplinary teams, you know, comprised of scientists, economists, engineers, architects, fabricators, artists, on and on and on. So a lot of experience with my hands in many different pots. And throughout this career trajectory, I've become a very flexible and adaptable person in terms of my profession. So here's a snapshot of my career timeline. There's a lot going on there. I've lived in several interesting cities and have had even more roles in that time. Some of these moves and job changes have occurred because I was either unhappy in a role or wanted to try something new. The others were a result of moving because my wife is an active duty Coast Guard member. And so we have to move around a little bit for her job. Fun fact, we actually met during grad school there at the U of A. I don't necessarily recommend this much job hopping. It's employers are definitely starting to raise eyebrows. You know, why is this? You know, why have you moved so, you know, had so many different roles and moved around? And the short answer is I wanted to find a job I wanted to find a career I was happy in and felt like I wanted to do every day. And so I think that, you know, as you exit school and you start to figure out what you want to do in your career, you should absolutely feel comfortable trying new things, especially if your current role isn't giving you the skills and experiences you want to have. Go try something new. Final twist on that storyline is I'm now in Berkeley, California. And so looking for yet another job opportunity. My current role with the River Authority is funded through Texas taxpayer dollars, and shocker, they don't want to see their taxpayer dollars leave the state. So I'm with them for a little bit longer, which is sad because I've loved this job. I feel like I found my niche. And so, you know, on to new things, Excelsior. So now I'm going to discuss my previous and current role as both a planner and landscape architect. And the hope here is that it sheds a bit of light on the kinds of opportunities, project types, scales that are out there for you post-graduation. So I'll detail out some of my daily tasks for each of my previous employers or project types that I worked on. Then I'll discuss a few specific projects and then the design and planning platforms I use to get to the final deliverable, which will be the graphics that I'll have displayed. You'll notice alongside each of those graphics or those deliverables is the programs I used to get there. So I really want you to take note of the diversity and project scale, scope, the clients, the programs used. It's a pretty broad range. So we'll start with Norris Design. I worked for Norris Design both there in Tucson and in the Denver offices. You can see some of my daily tasks as a land planner and landscape designer, you know, site design, permitting, plant surveying, irrigation plans. I would describe this as more of kind of a traditional planning and design firm. A lot of more of the smaller site scale design projects. It was an excellent experience, and I really got to hone my AutoCAD skills there. I put a lot of time in AutoCAD. I mean, a lot of time. I spent a lot of time in AutoCAD. And so because of that, I'm able to, although I don't work in AutoCAD very often anymore, I'm really able to jump back in whenever I need to. In fact, I had to do that recently and hop right into a project. The first project I want to highlight is one for Highlands Ranch in Colorado. So this was a subdivision that essentially cut off trail access to some public lands. The developer was required by both the state and federal agencies to implement easements, essentially. So they have to allow public to get through their subdivision so that they can still access those public amenities in the public forest and the trails, hunting grounds, all of those things. The key was to hide the trails from the neighbor's view. So these were pretty high-end homes, and the developer said, fine, we'll do it, but we don't want to see any hikers, which is pretty crazy. So, you know, we used a lot of GPS points, a lot of site analysis, viewshed analysis to make sure that we were able to weave, you know, a public access easement through the site. Pretty successful. The second I'm showcasing here is Aspen House near Frisco, Colorado. This was a cool project, adaptive reuse of a quarry site into a community center. So with the quarry site highly impacted, we had to do a lot of site studies and on-site inventory. You can see here AutoCAD, Trimble GPS, doing site analysis and inventory, hand rendering, Illustrator. And to accompany this plan set was a group of sections I used, and these help us create help us to get a sense of slope and scale. Next was Makers Architecture and Urban Design, excuse me, in Seattle, Washington. Here I was a federal planner, I did some community planning and a landscape architect. You can see here comp plans, sub-area plans, some urban design, TOD. This is my first introduction to transit-oriented development. And then a lot of work with military installation master plans, federal campuses, joint land use studies, impact feasibility studies. Pretty exciting stuff, and a little bit different than my previous role with Norris Design. Definitely more on the planning side of the spectrum. So the first project here is a a master plan for a Navy installation in Lemoore, California. The idea here was we wanted to create a new town center for this highly dispersed, unwalkable, kind of aging installation. It was actually a really unhealthy place for not only the sailors that worked there, but their family members that lived on site. And so we wanted to focus on those kind of quality of life elements, hike and bike trails, ped trails, more parks and open space. And so, you know, you think military planning and it might turn you off a little bit, but the reality is these are small towns, and you know, a lot of them are trying to achieve the same goals as any town in any state in the country or the world for that matter. So to accompany that master plan, we were asked to develop a public park or a public space where, you know, sailors, their families, and the community could interact through events or concerts or farmers markets or whatever, you know, you're programming a public space for these days. They wanted to break down some of those barriers that made the installation feel so isolated from the rest of the community. We wanted to remove that, you know, them and us mentality and make it just about, you know, the we. This was pretty successful, actually. I think they are currently, this was done back in 2013, and I think they are currently constructing this site. It looks a little bit different, but we got close. This was a visitor center for a place called Boundary Dam, which is along the Columbia River in Washington State. This is a small town called Penderay, Washington. And you can just, I wanted to showcase this because it was just a really quick concept at the back end of a larger project. And they said, hey, we need a visitor center, by the way, can you take us to 30%, you know, visioning through 30%. And so I had developed skills where I could, you know, take an ArcGIS analysis and do some quick, you know, site design work with my hands and a pencil, and take it into AutoCAD, and then, you know, finish it up in Illustrator to label it. And what this is highlighting is that, you know, even though this looks loose and sketchy and conceptual, you know, it's built on, you know, tangible data-driven metrics, which I always think is very important. It's not the pie in the sky, it's implementable. And finally, I did a lot of these diagrammatic overlays for sub-area plans and comprehensive plans and corridor master plans, all of the plans, essentially. And this one was developed for South Kincaid sub-area plan, which is in Mount Vernon, Washington, a really cool little town. And what I did was develop a series of alternatives that allowed the public and elected officials to make decisions based on the proposed future scenario. So we looked at, you know, underlying land use, future zoning, transportation infrastructure, parks and open space, proximity to the Skagit River, which you can see here, and its proximity. It actually locks, the site locks right into the downtown, which you can see labeled just to the north. And so this is alternative one, which was no action. You can see how unorganized the land use is. For being so close to the downtown area, you would expect some more organization. Alternative two, using kind of a two complete street concepts to better organize density. And then alternative three, organizing density along the transition zone from downtown to around the new civic campus and a downtown park. This alternative actually was the one that's selected. So the next step beyond creating these alternatives was to start to develop the goals and objectives and ultimately the policy that would help, you know, drive decision making and begin to shape the sub area in the preferred way. And finally, this is something I think is important. I almost didn't include it, but I thought it's important to showcase. And what it is, it's a simple trifold brochure that I developed in InDesign. And this was for another Navy installation in Fallon, Nevada. And when the project was wrapped up, you know, weeks later, you know, our deliverable was a master plan. It was a printed and bound document and a digital version, but the on-site planner called and said, hey, you know, this thing is kind of long and we've had a lot of people that are excited about this. Is there something that you can create for us that's just going to be shorter? Paraphrase what this thing is. It's a leave behind. And so I was asked to create this just trifold pamphlet that folks could hand out. And my point is, you never know how your skills will be needed. I didn't think I would be doing document production when I first entered the profession, but here I was. And subsequently, I was asked to do several other master plan documents following this. So it's just a quick little, trifold that has a lot of information packed into it that, hinges on some good graphics. Moving on to MIG, I worked as a community planner and landscape architect with MIG in the Denver, Seattle, and San Antonio office. In fact, I opened the San Antonio office along with my boss at the time. This was largely a planning role, a community planning role. MIG does a lot of community planning work. You can see here all the plans, the comprehensive, the streetscape master plan, the plans. You can read it. In addition to design guidelines and form-based code, so a new experience with kind of the detailed policy work that goes along with creating a master plan. This was analysis graphics used for both internal analysis and community workshops. They're conversation graphics, and they're used to help analyze the space. And this was for a downtown streetscape master plan in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. You can see, ArcGIS to Illustrator, pretty basic stuff. So here's your figure ground analysis. Took a look at zoning and connectivity. So both automobile, bus, streetcar, bike, pedestrian. There were about 6 other layers to this, but of course that's too many to show here. Next, this is a TOD project in Boise, Idaho, State Street TOD program envisioning. It's essentially a build out scenario we created to help guide policy decisions around a new bus rapid transit line that would basically, run from Boise State in downtown Boise, Idaho, kind of out to maybe the first suburban belt. Super cool project. There were like 5 stations in total that I did. And I had kind of free design reign. And so what I attempted to do was create the main street like arrangement of amenities. So using housing and amenities and open space to transform, a strip mall essentially into a vibrant TOD node. It was essentially an exercise in placemaking. So take the strip mall, auto-centric, and turn it into something that people want to be in. This was the Glenwood Street station. This is a project in Issaquah, Washington. It's the Northwest Gilman Boulevard Corridor Master Plan, kind of a lengthy title, but there you have it. This was an opportunities map. So we were looking at bike and pedestrian trails, increased density, new parks, open space, how to deal with environmentally sensitive areas, which was super cool. So there are a number of salmon-bearing rivers and streams that kind of bisect Northwest Gilman. And so you have to have a very light touch, not only because they're regulated heavily, because there's an economy that's based on these salmonoids, but because it's the right thing to do. And we were in the state of Washington, and they really value ecological health. The kind of incubator for this master plan is a new light rail station that is supposed to begin construction in 2025. It would be situated kind of just north of that Northwest Gilman label you see there. This is a very complex site with lots of layers to unpack and analyze. And we think this map, although it looks pretty intense, did a pretty good job of layering up that information in a clear and concise way that allowed community members, elected officials, stakeholders to have an honest conversation around. And finally, my current role as a sustainable infrastructure planner with the San Antonio River Authority. It's a public entity. Our mission is clean and healthy rivers, creeks, and watershed. This has been my most rewarding role thus far. I get to take all of my previous roles, so kind of a little bit of all of those projects I've highlighted thus far, and apply them to this engineering and science, like data heavy organization. I brought a new skill set that they hadn't really had before. There was only one other landscape architect in the organization, and he was a pretty technically heavy guy. He's also an engineer. And so my ability to, take my previous experience and help visualize data and modeling outputs. So watershed modeling, watershed data, crunching stormwater treatment calculations, and, putting those into a visualization that tells better stories about the health of the San Antonio River watershed. And so you can see some of the projects and roles I currently have, watershed protection plans, impervious cover mitigation studies, which we're doing for all of the regional centers in the San Antonio area. We're essentially, it's very cool stuff. We're looking at 20-year population projection, which is, the San Antonio region is supposed to increase by, it's projected to increase by about 1.1 million people. So we're looking at what that new land use will look like, what a full build out scenario looks like, how much more impervious cover, streets, parking lots, rooftops that adds, what those impacts on the river are, and how we can begin to mitigate those things through, restoration, conservation subdivisions, and most importantly, implementing green stormwater infrastructure, which I do a lot of. I do a lot of design and implementation of those. We do a lot of handholding for other public agencies and public developers and private developers. We also juggle grant and rebate programs. First example is just another one of those, hey, let's take the data and let's build an idea off of it. So this is St. Paul's Stormwater Park in San Antonio, Texas. The concept was created to show City Council how a park redesign would allow it to not only function as a community asset, but could capture and treat stormwater from a 50-year rainfall event. So essentially reducing nuisance flooding in the neighborhood. And so the idea here was to essentially send stormwater. You can see the top arrow. We're sending stormwater through a series of bioretention swales that are nestled in earthwork of a more kind of natural park-like setting, what you would think of a park. And then they outfall into an extended detention basin that doubles as a soccer pitch when it's dry. And I actually pulled this concept from some that exist in the Tucson area and the Phoenix area. There's a lot of those extended detention basins that are also baseball fields and soccer pitches. I used to play rugby on them, and they're not super comfortable, but they work. So what we did with this is, like I said, we crunched the numbers, we modeled the data. This is, a pragmatic solution. We thought, we presented it to the mayor and city council, just kind of on a whim. Hey, let's try this. And it got approved for 2021 capital improvement bonds. So it just goes to show you that you can pull those skills and use them to your advantage. Next is the Strasmire Wildland Park. This is a piece of property that the River Authority purchased. It's a historic ranch. It was one of the first post-Emancipation Proclamation, post-June 19th or Juneteenth. If you don't know what that is, Google it, write it down right now and look it up when we're done. But it was an ex-slave owned ranch here in the San Antonio River area, or there in the San Antonio River. So the intention was preserving the integrity of that site and the integrity of the natural river structure, which was intact, and really mature riparian and live oak forests, which were intact. And in addition to those historic structures, and the original cemetery. So just a lot of history wrapped up. It was like a little time capsule, just an awesome site. And so I was tasked with programming this site to allow for use, because it's part of, the taxpayer dollar deal. The public needs to be able to use it, but I wanted to make sure there was low impact uses. So I programmed in things like picnicking, kayaking, fishing, bird watching, no sports. And then we use this analysis and programming schematic to secure approval for the purchase of the property. So full success story. And finally, I wanted to show you a couple of photo simulation graphics that I use to, again, tell that story to the public when we don't have all the answers yet, but we just want to get an idea across. This first one is for a section of the river, it's the River Road crossing of the San Antonio River. So it's a restoration visioning graphic. This is a loved area, well-used area in an established neighborhood. The problem is that it's heavily degraded. This is actually a dam with a walkway over the top. And so there are a lot of invasive species, a lot of sediment has built up, and it's just an unhealthy place for native species. So we want to restore it. And we didn't know how to have that conversation with the public because they love it so much. And what we wanted to convey is that you can still have all these things and we can have ecological health as well. And so you get to keep your public amenities. Your kids can still explore, you can make the memories, you can still fish and watch birds, but there's going to be healthier habitat for the flora and fauna that call that place home. And the final project is the most recent. This is a Sheridan campus GSI retrofit. And so the River Authority recently purchased a large ex-community college campus with the intention of essentially consolidating all of our satellite offices into one big happy campus. And we ask folks to mitigate stormwater and treat their stormwater, so we have to do it ourselves. And so after analyzing how to treat all the stormwater, where to capture it, what to do with it, where it ties into the infrastructure, we wanted to go after some EPA grants that would help fund some of this stuff, because they can be a little bit expensive, especially when they're retrofitted like this, meaning that the site's already constructed and you're trying to go back and fit them in where you can. And it was a $350 EPA grant. And what we essentially did was took this main bioretention basin and created a living laboratory. So it's a huge bioretention basin. It will capture and treat approximately 80% of the stormwater from the remaining parking surfaces. And we were successful and secured the funding with this single graphic. So here's a list of the platforms that I've used. And most of these aren't one-offs. It's a process. I go from Excel to ArcGIS to CAD to Illustrator to whatever. And so I may not be highly proficient in all of them any longer, but I can still speak the language, which is a huge help when managing those multidisciplinary project teams. Here is my experience with the desired skill progression. And I thought this was important to add to this discussion. Entry-level folks, you need to have kind of the technical skills to support the project team. And as you become more senior, you really need to develop those interpersonal skills to manage the team. And those technical skills become less important because you now have more junior members on your team with those skills that can support you. However, and I can't stress this enough, it is very important to stay current on design trends and new technology, even at the senior level. You don't have to be, dangerous with the new technology, but you want to have that working knowledge, and it'll only make you a better leader. You will experience, a boss or a partner or whoever coming to you, and they'll say, move this line in this, final graphic, move this line and get it back to me. And what they don't realize is that's a 10-step process because they don't understand the technology it took to get you there. And so, you have to go back to ArcGIS and re-export and take that into CAD and save that down and open up an Illustrator. And it's like, how come this is taking so long? And it's not as simple as that. And so, so if you're someone who's very strong at either end of the spectrum, maybe you're great technically, but you're not so good with people, or vice versa, I highly recommend developing those skills at the other end. You don't have to do it overnight, but it's something that you need to work towards throughout your career. So to wrap up, I want to discuss alternative careers for the planning and design professions. I know that a lot of you are thinking about kind of the architect stuff, or going and working for the New York City planning department, doing high profile projects. However, I encourage you to explore other opportunities to use your knowledge and skills to have an impact. I mean, that's not the only way. There are many pathways for us to explore aside from the traditional route, and probably even more than this list that haven't been realized yet. So if you're out there looking for a job and something sparks your interest or catches your eye, but it doesn't say, planner or designer or landscape architect or whatever in the position title, but you think your skills and talents and interests apply there, go for it. Go for it. That's how I landed my current role. You just need to inform the folks that you want to work for that they need your skills. They just don't know it yet. And finally, I think, again, going for the position with the private firm is a great way to start. It definitely builds your skill sets. You're able to manage large workloads, understand how the industry works. But in my opinion, you won't be those change makers that we need. I think if you really want to drive change and begin to tilt the balance back in the way of progression, I don't know what other word to use there, you should ultimately make your way to the public sector. And I'll tell you why. This is the most impactful thing you can do, in my opinion. So think about a really important, high profile, impactful project in your hometown or state or your country or whatever. Chances are that project didn't begin with a private sector planner or designer seeding the idea. It probably sprouted from a community member or a social or environmental need that was ultimately championed by somebody on the public sector, whether that be a mayor, a city council member, somebody in the public works department, capital improvements, wastewater parks, whatever. These are all future positions for you, for planners and landscape architects and architects. In the public sector, you know, you can propose the projects, you get to select the design teams, you get to steer a lot of those planning and design solutions, and most importantly, you get to fund and drive the dollars. So if you're working on a project and you're thinking to yourself, this project needed $100,000 more in order to be really successful and really have impact, it's watered down, it's going to be just okay, you need to be that person that is allocating those funds, and you can do that. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I appreciate your time. Like I said, if you have any questions that you feel uncomfortable asking here, feel free to shoot me an email. Not a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. I would like to now open it up for questions. What you can do is just send a chat to the group and I'll call on you. If you have a question, looking for the chat box. There we go. And I also wanted to say that one of the things Brandon has pointed out so eloquently is the close relationship between the fields of planning and landscape architecture. And while Brandon was fortunate enough to have both degrees, many of our students will get one or the other, but there are probably some, if you're a landscape architect, there's probably some training or preparation or courses that would be useful to you. If you're a planner, some landscape architecture courses that you might find interesting. So Brandon, I wondered if you might be able to say a few words about that. If someone was just getting a landscape architecture degree, what would they need to know about planning going into the field, and vice versa with planners and landscape architecture work?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, it's always a good idea to explore courses in other disciplines, especially the allied professions. And honestly, you know, unless you want to just do kind of that traditional plant palette landscape architecture, you know, small scale site design work, or just work on planning policy where you're doing a lot of writing and drafting, I don't know where one profession ends and the other begins in the middle. I mean, you know, planners design, it's just at a different scale. You know, when you're implementing a sub area plan or you're looking at zoning regulations, that's ultimately design work, and you're laying the foundation for what design decisions can and cannot be made. And obviously on the more design end of the spectrum, you know, when when landscape architects are working at larger scales, you're using those same planning skills. I mean, looking at systems, system thinks, and community needs. So certainly go, you know, explore, you know, take a design course or take a planning policy course, or make sure you're, you know, getting your GIS in, try out CAD. It all, you know, it's all beneficial ultimately.
So do we have any questions among the group? I don't have any coming through on chat, so I thought I would make another.
Yeah, Gina, thank you. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to type it out, but
That's
I think
okay. Go ahead, Bo.
I've been too slow. Yeah, Brandon, so nice to meet you. I feel so sorry. I was caught up in another meeting. I know you talk, and so glad to see you in San Diego last year, and so glad can come to join us. Again, really excellent presentation. I enjoying everything you presented.
Thank you.
Similar question or comment as Gina just mentioned, because you get both credentials in landscape architecture and planning. And we often talk about the planners, they drive the direction of change. It's more of a sort of a not like a landscape architecture focusing on one project and you can get it done, see it implemented. But planner is more on a policy level thing, the directions. And so I just want to maybe have you talk a little bit more about that, because I see we have students graduating with landscape architecture profession degrees, then they really fell in love in planning eventually in the long term, and some planning. Yeah, so I just want to get you, maybe you can mention a little more about how people explore that, their personal interests, their career goals, or do they need a credential for either one of those or both? Have been doing so successfully.
Yeah, and I don't think so. I think it'd be a little bit tougher for a planner to make the argument that they can do the same work as a landscape architect when it comes to that really site-specific design work. But anything beyond that scale, I think a planner with a good set of tools can do any of that work and push for any of that work. And vice versa, I think that landscape architects make fantastic city planners. In fact, I've worked for a couple planning department directors that they were not in fact planners, they were landscape architects, just because both professions, like I mentioned previously, think at that system scale. And I think that's what you need to be able to do in order to be really effective. What are my community needs? What are my environmental needs? What social equity goals are we trying to reach? And you need to be able to plug those into the system as a whole. It's not about that single site. I think, if you're looking at a park or something really dialed like a traditional landscape architect might, it's also important to think about that beyond just the site and how that works within a larger system. So I think both of those is, as long as you have those skills, I think both of those transfer to one another really well. And that's why I mentioned, if you see a job that sparks your interest, if you're a landscape architect and you're liking planning work a little bit more, go for that. If you're a planner and you've got some design skills and you see, an urban design role, I mean, that's kind of a really kind of anonymous term used to capture a lot of different professions. Urban design is that placemaking, anything between kind of the facade of the first floor to the other side of the street, to that first floor's facade. And anybody can do that, and anybody can have those ideas. And oftentimes the decisions and policy are driven by planners and implemented by architects and civil engineers and landscape architects, but planners can also help implement those as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon.
Sure.
I have a question coming in from Christian Aguilar.
Okay.
Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure. What would you say is your favorite experience in all your professional career?
My favorite experience has definitely been the restoration work that I'm doing now. A lot of urban ecological health is directly connected to community health, and vice versa. And so a lot of the restoration work that we're doing within the city of San Antonio and urban areas, especially underserved communities, it's not just looking at the restoration of the river corridor and the channel for habitat, but it's the uplands and it's the accessibility and the open space buffers along with that. And so I find that's been, absolutely thrilling work. And it's, I pull from all of my other previous experiences. It's GIS mapping, it's a little bit of modeling, it's CAD work, it's, creating presentations for the public in photo simulations and diagrams. And I've been able to just, pull all of that together and I think have a pretty good impact. But yeah, certainly the restoration stuff. Plucks my heartstrings.
We have a question from Irene Ogata. Irene, do you want to ask your question?
you can just read it in the chat. It was.
You want me to ask it for you? I can't hear you very well.
That would be fine.
Okay. So Irene asks, what was it at the San Antonio River Authority that made you feel you found your passion?
You know, it was during the interview process. I quickly realized that they, you know, like I stated earlier, I'm trying to figure out how I can put this in a delicate way. They're a very engineering and science data heavy organization, which makes a lot of sense. But I quickly realized that they were having maybe a little bit of difficulty communicating their intentions to the public, even though they've been around since the early 1900s. And I quickly realized that I'd be one of only 2 landscape architects in the entire organization, in the almost 300 person organization. And I had these skills that they didn't have yet. Again, all those visualization skills and those analysis skills. And so, you know, that light bulb kind of clicked. It was like, wow, I get to do watershed, you know, conservation, you know, river, creek, riparian area, restoration work, and then fold in all of that planning scale stuff. And on top of that, I get to do these great visualizations, which I think are really fun. So it was kind of at that interview stage when I realized it was a great fit for me. And it has been so far. I think they keep, you know, I can't speak for them, but I think they'd like to keep me if they could. Fortunately, they cannot. So good question. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Mark de la Torre. Do you want me to ask it, or do you want to ask it?
No, it was just more of an observation and a compliment that the value add side of things. I thought that was a really important theme through what Brandon's presented to date about maybe looking to a non-traditional profession to figure out what their efficiencies are and where you might be able to build upon some of those based on your own expertise or the diversity in your education and profession. So just a kudos there. First time caller, long time fan.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. And I want to point out that, you know, we're talking about, you know, the shared skill set and different training between landscape architecture and planning. Irene Ogata, who just asked that last question, is an example of someone who is both a landscape architect and a planner and works in the public sector, City of Tucson. And I also have an MLA, a landscape architecture degree, and ended up in urban planning, where, you know, in my group, I was the only one who had that sort of skill set to do existing conditions analysis and things on neighborhood plans. So there's room for, I think there is room for landscape architects and planning departments.
Yeah, and I would say, if I could add to that, you know, if you're a planner who's interested in design and you don't want to take a course, you know, take advantage of the really inexpensive Adobe Suite that's available. I think it's probably still available through the bookstore. And they have incredible tutorials on that stuff now, and sit there and just play with it a little bit. And if it's something that sparks your interest, I promise you, it'll hook you in and you'll figure out, you know, all kinds of things you can create in those programs. So.
Thank you. You know, it's 12:50 right now, so I'm going to wrap up the lecture. And Brandon, I really want to thank you for your participation, your willingness to come and talk to the students and other professionals who've joined us today about your experience and your various career settings and your projects, which are really fascinating. So thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for participating. And I think our technology went very smoothly, and cross our fingers we'll have such great luck the rest of the semester. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck to you all.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you so much.
Very nice.
Of course.
Nice to see our alum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Take care.